Welcome, everyone. I see participants trickling in, so I think we'll get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining today's launch event for Riverscope. Sorry, just turning my own camera on. Hi, welcome, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for joining today's launch event for Riverscope. I'm Maureen Harris, Director of Programs at International Rivers, and we're very excited about this opportunity to share Riverscope, an initiative that has been under development for the last 18 months. Riverscope is developed in collaboration with our colleagues at TMP Systems, who you'll hear from shortly. Before we get started, I just wanted to introduce International Rivers for those who don't know us. International Rivers is an international advocacy NGO dedicated to protection of rivers and defending the rights of communities who depend on them. We have regional offices in South Africa, Thailand, Brazil, and South Asia, where we support organizations and communities to advocate for healthy freshwater ecosystems and to prevent destructive river developments, including hydropower dams that adversely impact communities and the environment. In our work around the world, we've seen that issues such as widespread population displacement, threats to food security, loss of biodiversity, and Indigenous cultures are some of the severe impacts that are frequently associated with hydropower development. However, one of the things we consistently find in our campaigns is that social and environmental impacts are not properly assessed in project design and planning for hydropower projects, that they tend to be underestimated. And within financing and development models, we often see that environmental and social impacts and risks can be outsourced or externalized from developers and investors to communities and the environment. Meanwhile, environmental and social impacts are often not well understood by investors and financiers, and they don't adequately factor into due diligence, early project assessments, and cost-benefit analyses. We also often find in our dialogues on these issues with investors and developers that we're not speaking the same language, or we're speaking at cross purposes to each other, or these issues are sometimes not even on their radar. At the same time, environmental and social issues are often relegated by developers and investors to secondary concerns without acknowledging the very real financial implications of construction delays and other issues on project bottom lines. So it was in part to address this disconnect that led to the idea for the Riverscope initiative with our colleagues from TMP Systems. Riverscope is a geospatial tool that assesses environmental and social risks from the earliest stages of project planning and connects them quantitatively to the commercial performance of hydropower projects. The tool is developed with the aim of supporting better energy planning and investment decision-making. We see Riverscope as part of a broader toolbox that includes rigorous human rights and environmental standards and due diligence practices that will help identify, avoid, or mitigate risks. So without giving too much more away, I'll introduce TMP Systems, who will present on the Riverscope tool and methodology. TMP is a consultancy firm based in the UK with staff in the US, South Africa, and the Philippines. TMP's work spans asset management, commercial investment, systems design in carbon, energy, land use, and ESG diligence. Their client base ranges from the US and Europe to Brazil, Indonesia, Kenya, and beyond, and includes asset managers, governments, researchers, foundations, and civil society organizations. TMP have experience developing similar methodology using data-driven and quantitative assessments of social and environmental issues. And specifically, their work on Riverscope draws on a methodology they have already developed and refined for Landscope. And this is a tool to assess social, environmental, and financial risk in the land sector. This work has been funded by the UK's Department for International Development and has proven influential with investors, governments, and civil society. This project emerged out of exploratory discussions on how a similar methodology could be applied in hydro and energy planning and due diligence affecting rivers. I should say here at the outset also that the Riverscope tool is not necessarily a finished product. It's still subject to further refinement. We plan to roll out this methodology into a larger phase that will cover many more projects. An important component of Riverscope is also investigative study that complements data-driven quantitative assessments with qualitative information. And this includes obtaining on-the-ground information and local knowledge to bolster assessment findings, which providing opportunities for community and local civil society input. And while the COVID pandemic limited our ability to ground truth, the assessments for our initial case studies that we'll be presenting today, we did benefit in each project from information from counterparts and partners working in each country or region. So I'd like to thank the organizations that have provided financial and other support to help develop Riverscope. In particular, our thanks to the Arcus Foundation and the Mekong Inclusion Project, which is a collaboration with Oxfam and is supported by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. And before we move on to the presentations, just some quick housekeeping. This event is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. After Ben and Justin present, we'll open up to Q&A, and my colleague Josh will manage the Q&A session. Feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the presentations. And once the presentations are over, you can also raise your hand if you prefer to ask the questions verbally. We're aiming to end at the hour, but there's a little flexibility to carry over if need be. So thank you all once again for taking the time to be here. Very excited to have you and to share the Riverscope tool with you. And with that intro, I'll hand over to Ben Bowie from TMP Systems to share the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Maureen. And thank you to International Rivers for organising this event. And of course, thank you to everyone for taking the time to attend and participate. TMP Systems, as Maureen has explained, is a finance and technology consultancy. And we've helped some of the world's largest companies and investors to solve complex social and environmental problems. And one of the products that we're most proud of is Landscope, which was developed over a 5 to 7 year process with support from 9 development finance institutions, and has since been tested for over 2 years by thousands of companies and investors. So it's on these tried and tested foundations that we're looking to evolve Riverscope, and we're very excited to present it here today. I'm Ben Bowie, I'm the Managing Director of TMP Systems, and I'm joined here by Justin Moole, who has been leading the development of the tool. And we're really excited to get your feedback on it. You can find lots of information about Riverscope at the website for the tool, www.riverscope.org. So we're going to try and keep this presentation to about half an hour to maximize time for question and answers. We've got a lot to cover. We do proceed over 4 sections. I'll take the first and the last one before handing over to my colleague Justin to fill in the details on the second and third. The first section covers, why we're here today, what the problem we're trying to solve here is. And that's that hydropower assessments regularly lead to bad outcomes for investors, for energy planners, and for local people. And those bad outcomes are avoidable through better assessment processes. We're providing a solution here, Riverscope, which is a standardized, comparable, and rapid GIS assessment tool that allows us to look at the most pressing risks in the operating environment and determine what impact those risks will have on the bottom lines of hydropower assets. Our third section takes you through some of the key findings from our study of our geospatial analysis of 281 dams across the world, and presents our results from an application of our methodology to 5 planned hydropower assets. And to provide a bottom line to these key findings, we find that hydropower is expensive and alternatives can often be cheaper. Finally, we get to the last section of this presentation, which takes you through how Riverscope can be useful to you and how we intend to develop it in the future, should we see demand for that development. But before we get into the meat of the presentation, I'm just going to provide you with some top line results. So the first thing to notice is that dams are exposed to extremely long delays. The mean average of the 281 dams we looked at was a decade. That's on top of an extremely long development period in the first instance. And that kind of delay regularly is going to change the value proposition of a dam fundamentally. You know, what we realized is that in many instances, dams at the end of the day are likely to be more expensive than available alternative energy technologies like solar. We found on average across our 5 pilots that hydropower was about 49% more expensive to solar. But what our methodology can do, crucially, is help you to remove some of that uncertainty by seeing roughly how long the delays that a hydropower asset might be exposed to, and roughly how much more expensive than solar it might be, or indeed if it is potentially competitive or cheaper. So the second thing we realized from our examination was that context was king, and that wasn't necessarily being factored into the hydropower assessment process to a sufficient degree. But what we also realized was that these risks were extremely hard to avoid. To our surprise, we found that hydropower was at greatest risk in the areas that were actually kind of remote. You know, so developers looking for kind of unspoiled areas where they're not going to come into contact with social risks are often have nasty surprises as they realize that these remote areas are in fact festooned with complexities and difficulties. So our study really started to underline the fact that hydropower risk varies very substantially by location, in large part because different locations have different ESG conditions, and so hydropower is exposed to different kinds of environmental and social risks. But despite this fact that context is such a determining factor and that environmental and social conditions are so important, we realized that many dams were still being developed in extremely high risk areas. And that was really contributing to these bad outcomes that I mentioned earlier for investors, local people, and energy planners. And that was really well demonstrated by some key results across our 5 pilot applications. What we can see here is across our 5 pilots, we found that dams were exposed to long delays on our right column that resulted in large reductions in the valuation of the projects, as we can see in the NPV losses. And that made them significantly more expensive than solar in every instance. Now we can see that the tool allows us to differentiate between the risk exposure of these different assets. But really, if Riverscope had been applied at an early stage for any of these projects, it seems unlikely that they would have got to this stage. So how does Riverscope provide value to you guys? So firstly, investors, we think that Riverscope can be really valuable as a screening tool, particularly for greenfield assets. But because it can be used rapidly and is highly comparable, you can also use it to screen portfolios and to compare hydropower to different investment opportunities to ensure you're getting the optimal mix. Energy planners can do a similar sort of thing at a macro level, using Riverscope to help their spatial planning process to ensure that they're finding the areas which have the lowest social risk, the greatest impact, and the greatest opportunity to drive economic development and reduce energy poverty. Finally, NGOs can benefit from Riverscope because it provides them with a way to add numbers and quantitative basis to their advocacy. And this kind of numeric quantitative approach really provides a common point of reference so that NGOs can start to engage more constructively and productively with the other stakeholder groups that we've listed here. And indeed, part of the point of Riverscope, as Maureen mentioned, is to help these different groups to work more effectively together. So before I hand over to Justin and get into the nuts and bolts of the tool, I'm just going to provide a little more insight into why we think there is a problem with hydropower assessments at the moment. Now, the main issue is that these assessment processes significantly underestimate the degree to which environmental and social impacts create commercial risks for the construction and operation of large dams. In particular, they seem to treat environmental and social issues as a compliance issue. And that means that they are treated after a normally long, slow, and expensive technical assessment, and are treated as obstacles to the development of the project rather than as genuine risk factors. And finally, it's very clear that most hydropower assessments are extremely esoteric and extremely technical, and most stakeholders lack any means to kick their tires, to verify them. And so Riverscope provides an independent source of information that complements the existing technical and hydrological studies that we see are commonplace in the sector. Now, we're putting so much emphasis on environmental and social risks for hydropower here, because it's important to realize that in this sector, these risks are qualitatively different than they are for most other energy assets. So displacement provides a pretty good example of this, where we might see another energy investment like solar displace maybe hundreds of people in extreme cases. We found that large hydropower typically displaces tens of thousands of people. And this kind of challenge is, as we've already seen, extremely difficult to avoid. You can't just go to a remote location. You kind of need to get into the guts of it and deal with the complexity. And that takes time and that takes money. And that means that hydropower assets are regularly delayed and come in significantly over budget. We've already discussed the fact that these will be delayed by pretty long periods. But our research also reinforced previous research that found that most large hydropower assets in emerging markets come in about 33% over budget. Now that's a substantial proportion, but becomes even more striking when we think about the nameplate budgets attached to these projects, which are regularly, in the hundreds of millions and billions. So these delays and cost overruns, which can be regularly linked to negotiating environmental and social complexities, are very significant. And we're talking about delay periods that are so long that by the time the dam comes to the market conditions have often kind of changed fundamentally. It's very difficult to predict 15 years into the future, as events like the virus underline so clearly. And often, for example, we'll see situations in which demand has reduced significantly over that period, as we're seeing in Southeast Asia at the moment, or where competitors like solar and wind have become far, far cheaper and far easier to deploy. So what we're looking at here is a set of risk factors that even the most capable developers and investors are going to struggle to deal with, that put many assets into a position where they're really kind of entering kind of uncharted, unpredictable territory far in the future. And we really just don't necessarily need to be exposed to these risks if we look for them early using reliable data. And with that, I will hand you over to Justin.
Great, thanks, Ben. And yeah, thanks to all of you for joining us today. So I'm going to be taking you through kind of the nuts and bolts of Riverscope, as it were, how it works. We'll be looking at some of the indicators that we've used. And then, of course, I'll also introduce the different pilot cases that we've applied Riverscope to thus far. So the Riverscope approach relies on these three layers of assessment to form this kind of comprehensive way to assess hydropower risks. So this first layer that we draw on is this geospatial assessment. And here the purpose was really to be able to see if we could assess whether one location was higher risk than another, but also to do this at a level of analysis that is useful for projects, right? So here we draw on our tried and tested methodology from Landscope, but we've adjusted it slightly for Riverscope by focusing specifically on hydropower investments. So what we did was we examined 281 dam cases, looking specifically at their geospatial characteristics. And we tested a whole range of environmental and social and governance indicators to test whether any of these indicators showed a statistical correlation with cases that had experienced delays. And what we found was 17 of these indicators at a level that was useful to us, that's a subnational level, all of which showed a strong statistical relationship with delays. And what that means is it allows us to then score projects using these 17 indicators based on their location. So we score these projects on a scale of 0 to 100, and the score then gives us a range of potential delays for that location. And that's really useful because then we can input those delays into a financial modeling process, and that takes us to the second layer of assessment that Riverscope offers. So in our financial model, the purpose here is really to translate these delays into financial terms. And the discounted cash flow model here is really, really useful because we can input these delays and it spits out these commonly used financial terms like net present value, levelized cost of electricity. And these are really useful because they're both widely understood by investors, energy planners, but they're also easily comparable with other technologies. And that's really what we're trying to achieve as well. So then taking us to the third layer of assessment, you know, especially from our experience with the Landscope, we realized that a purely quantitative assessment can be limited in its approach, and numbers don't always paint the full picture, right? So we back up these initial quantitative assessments with a thorough qualitative investigation. And here the key is to really look for any gaps in the data that we might pick out, or look for things that are particularly hard to quantify, say biodiversity loss, a loss of livelihoods, etc. And then to back that up with thorough expert investigation through, for example, our partners at International Rivers who have local on-the-ground experience with some of these issues. So together, these three layers form this kind of comprehensive assessment approach for assessing hydropower risks. These are the 17 indicators that we use, these geospatial indicators split between social and environmental groups. And a couple of things to point out here. Firstly, you'll notice quite a couple of these are quite intuitive in terms of the risks that they might pose for the hydropower sector. So, you know, things like water scarcity, access to drinking water, there's no real surprise there. But what we also found was that this wasn't always the case. So as Ben's already mentioned, we found that areas with low population density, more remote areas were actually higher risk. And what this really demonstrates is the value of this statistical selection process that we use to determine these different indicators. Another important thing to point out is that all of these data sets that we draw from are publicly available. They've been tried, tested, thoroughly tested, and they're coming from, you know, reputable organizations, some from NASA, we're talking World Resources Institute, Oxford University, and they're all available at the level that is useful for us, and that's the localized project level. So moving on to, so this just gives you a visual representation of how we present our geospatial outputs. And the purpose here is, you know, these outputs are often quite technical in nature, so we really wanted to try and present these in a way that's intuitive, easy to understand, and relatable. So we score these indicators from 0 to 100. We give them a simple color coding system, as you can see over here, and then we provide a brief interpretation of the results as well, again, just for ease of understanding and ease of interpretation. So moving on to our 5 pilot cases. You'll see the different locations here, all in emerging markets across the world, mostly Southeast Asia, and they share a couple of commonalities. So they're all large projects. As Ben mentioned, they're all in planning phases of development, and they're all quite expensive. On average, an estimated budget of $3 billion across the projects. But as much as they're quite similar in these ways, as far as large hydropower goes, they're actually quite different in terms of their context and characteristics. And that was really important for us to be able to test Riverscope, you know, to be able to test it with these different backgrounds and to see how it performs. And as far as we understand, it's performed pretty successfully. So now moving on to our key findings. I'll go through these in kind of 3 broad categories here. Firstly, we'll look at the commercial case, which we found to be particularly useful from an investor and energy planning perspective. We then look at some of the slightly lesser recognized risks in the hydropower sector associated with transmission and offtake. And then finally, looking at some of the environmental and social impacts of hydropower, which are particularly relevant from a concessional finance perspective. So over here, you'll see, as Ben's already mentioned, hydropower often suffer from long delays. Sometimes these delays can be extraordinarily long, half my lifetime, sometimes even longer. And this becomes particularly striking when we compare these with the time that it takes, for example, solar and wind to get to market, as we show here on the graph. What you also notice on the graph is, even without delays, hydropower already takes a long time to reach the market. And, by comparison, solar and wind, these timeframes are actually getting shorter, whereas hydro, they tend to be getting longer, or at least so it seems. And these delays, of course, have a significant impact on the commercial case for a project. We found that across our pilot projects, we expected to see an average net present value of -40%. And that's a significant loss, especially given that these are not necessarily based on the worst case scenarios. So that quoted figure is based on median expected delays. Our worst case scenarios were, -160, -190 net present value. So on this graph, so what we're trying to show you here is a comparison between the end cost of electricity for a local solar project versus that of a hydropower project over time. And what becomes immediately noticeable is that the cost curve for solar, represented by the green line, is sharply declining over time, whereas that for hydro is rapidly increasing. And this means a couple things. Firstly, the longer that it takes for stakeholders to make decisions around these projects, the longer that it takes for these projects to reach the market, the less competitive hydropower is becoming, especially when compared to the rapidly falling costs of solar. So in this particular case for hydro, we've represented three different cost curves here. And those are to indicate potential budget overruns and potential different scenarios. We found that hydropower often runs quite significantly over budget, on average 33% over budget. So in this case for Luang Prabang, we expect to see the project to only come online in 2030 after delays are factored in. If we assume a budget overrun of 33%, it's already going to be 77% more expensive than local alternatives. But we also know that these delays can often be far, far worse. So, in a worst case scenario for Luang Prabang is something more like 2040, where it'll be 150% more expensive than local alternatives. And these figures for solar are based on local projects. They're based on local figures. So this is not necessarily some extreme case scenario for solar. Okay, so, another rather unusual feature of hydropower is they often require these extremely long transmission lines, especially when we compare them to other energy technologies. And we're talking about, way over 100 kilometers in length, sometimes 500-600 kilometers in length. And, it's very likely a feature of them being situated in these remote areas, but that then brings us a whole nother set of challenges. So because these areas are often so remote, they're pristine, which means there's very little infrastructure. These require new lines or significant upgrades to existing infrastructure. And that just exposes the project to a whole nother set of environmental and social risks and the delays that are associated with that. So you can see from an energy planning perspective, this starts to become really, really challenging. You're not just dealing with these large projects, which are often delays by significant periods of time, but now you're also dealing with the risks and the delays that are associated with transmission as well. Moving on to our environmental and social findings. So hydropower is notorious for its impacts on local people and on local ecosystems. This is not something that we need to hark on for too long. We know these things. But what we did find is that hydropower oftentimes, the assessment processes oftentimes underestimate these, especially in terms of the number of people that are affected. So we found that on average, across the projects that we looked at, an average of 53,000 people would be affected either physically or economically by the local pilot projects that we looked at. And this was significantly more than the project assessments suggested. And these people are also not necessarily getting the kinds of job opportunities that you might expect for projects with this level of impact. But we've also found that hydropower also, the impacts don't extend to just the local or even national level. They sometimes reach regional level impacts as well. And this is really clear in the Mekong region, where rapid hydropower development is both threatening some endangered species, the Irrawaddy dolphin, for example. This is irreparable loss, but it's also threatening regional food security here, potentially future economic prosperity for the Mekong region. At a global level, hydropower is particularly relevant from a climate perspective. And there's at least two key things to point out here. So firstly, hydropower is oftentimes a driver of deforestation, and Brazil is a pretty clear example of that. But at the same time, tropical reservoirs, and many hydropower these days are being developed in tropical regions. These reservoirs are oftentimes quite significant methane emitters. So as much as hydropower oftentimes is a driver of climate impacts, it's also vulnerable to climate change. So again, using Brazil as an example here, between 2012 and 2015, they experienced a major drought, and they saw a 15% loss in hydropower output. So for a country that is reliant on hydropower, this is a significant loss, especially when we bear in mind that climate change is only expected to get worse over time. So I'm going to be passing you back to Ben now, and he'll give you a sense of what's next for Riverscope. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Justin. And we obviously saw how some of those environmental and social impacts of hydropower will disqualify the technology from lots of ESG funds and the like. But the point that we're really trying to make here and underline is that environmental and social issues have operational impacts on dams that are not externalities and are core to the business. So how can the different stakeholder groups that we've discussed use that information? So investors, we've already talked about the way that we can use Riverscope to do project level analyses. If any investors out there are interested in further pilots of Riverscope for assets within their portfolios, please reach out and let us know. We do have limited capacity to support further pilots with the funding in place. But as noted, Riverscope is very powerful because it can be applied rapidly and on a comparable basis. So we're looking also for expressions of interest, rather, on how we can apply the system to different market segments. So it can certainly be applied to portfolios, for portfolio balancing and so on. But we can also look at benchmarking different companies or comparing different regions, or indeed comparing different basins, which is the proper level of analysis for hydropower assets. We are looking at whether there's enough demand for this to automate Riverscope. If you're interested in understanding what that looks like, go to landscope.info and you'll see how that tool works and can be used by any individual with information as simple as the location of the asset in question. For energy planners, we're really looking to support better spatial planning of energy assets. So we think that Riverscope can play a really useful role there, but we'd like to develop it further by taking greater account of transmission issues, offtake risks, and also storage challenges and opportunities. Hydropower can be used for storage. Of course, pump storage is by far the most common form of electricity storage that's used. But we also need to better consider the role of storage for alternatives and what that means for their business case. But what we really want to do is to be able to provide energy planners with specific alternative suggestions to hydropower. It's all well and good to go to an energy planner and say that this gigawatt dam is a problem, but they're unlikely to move away from those sorts of plans significantly until they can meet their priorities in terms of dealing with energy poverty and driving economic development. And to do that, they will need a direct alternative that is either cost competitive or cheaper. Finally, NGOs and experts. If any of you are interested, we can provide training on how to use Riverscope and the kind of approaches that it used. That includes support and training on GIS analysis and research, as well as how you can apply Riverscope, the quantitative bit, and do the qualitative bit yourself. And that really is part of the aim here, that we provide a way of kind of scaling up and democratizing the tools that people can use to produce robust and comprehensive assessments of hydropower that recognize both the key financial and commercial issues and the key social and environmental issues. So with that, I'll conclude the presentation and we'll move to the question and answer phase. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Very much appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Ben, and thanks, Justin. So yeah, we'll move to question and answers now. So you can either raise your hand if you want to speak, or you can submit a written question. I guess we would ask, if you are submitting a written question, to kindly indicate your affiliation or your organization. So one of the ones that I would maybe pick out from those that have been sent already is from Connie from Riverwatch, who asks how climate change is, whether it's already included as a risk in the tool, considering modified river flows that might affect output.
Thanks very much indeed, Josh. So the quantitative methodology that Riverscope uses is historical in nature. So we're looking at how existing dams have performed to try and predict how dams will perform in the future, which is the kind of necessary process for a statistical and robust approach. And for that reason, the quantitative part of the tool doesn't factor in climate change, because we just don't have reliable enough data on how specifically that will affect dams in different locations. However, as Justin noted, climate is a big factor for hydropower, both in the sense that hydropower is a driver, and as you're mentioning, that the technology is exposed to climate change. So in our qualitative treatment and in our discussion of the quantitative indicators that relate to issues like water variability and interannual variability in water, we do discuss the way that these scores could change as a result of climate change. And we're also putting out a special summary paper that focuses specifically on this issue of climate change, because it's very clear that the sorts of impacts that have recently been predicted in the IPCC 6th assessment report are going to have a significant role to play in the future of hydropower. And what we're already seeing is most dams, to be kind of socially acceptable, can't have a big reservoir. They have to be run of the river. And that makes them extremely exposed to hydropower impacts. And so in practice, many of these technologies are becoming increasingly variable, and they aren't actually providing or promising to provide the sort of consistent baseload power that we see in the future. So these things are currently best treated in our qualitative processes, and that qualitative investigation can have quantitative sources, but for the time being, because it's just too hard to predict where the climate impacts will land, we're not factoring that in to the quantitative bit.
Thanks. And maybe one related question, when you spoke about run-of-river, Amelie Huber asked how well the tool differentiates between large reservoir projects, which cause huge levels of inundation and displacement, versus run-of-river hydro in mountainous areas that typically have less of a social footprint.
Yeah, so I mean, the principal way that we account for that is in the way that we look at the social and environmental risk factors around the dam. So we do use, as Justin mentioned, different levels of analysis. We look at impacts immediately around the dam. We look at impacts upstream, and that's really the one that changes most kind of drastically with inundation. And then we look at impacts kind of downstream at a macro level. So the tool currently doesn't, beyond that, make a specific distinction between those two different technology types, because it's relatively agnostic. What we're trying to do is provide people with information which they can then use to understand, you know, what risk their specific project, about which we don't necessarily know the details, you know, what risk they're exposed to there. But one thing that I will say is that, you know, all of the examples that we looked at in our pilots were classified as run-of-the-river designs, but all of them, as Justin mentioned, were associated with displacement of over 50,000 people on average. So I think it's just important for us to underline that while particularly smaller hydropower and run-of-the-river designs can, in some instances, reduce these risk factors significantly, when we're looking at large hydropower, which is the focus of this tool, run-of-the-river designs often are similarly exposed to social and environmental risks.
Thanks, Ben. We've got a question from Atley Harby, who, to summarize, kind of asked how we compare, how Riverscope compares the variable power output from solar versus hydropower, which is, you know, traditionally considered, you know, base load or dispatchable power output. Are we kind of just comparing sheer kilowatt hours, or how are we doing that?
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great question. And I think this is one of the areas where the tool can be improved most. At the moment, we really are comparing kind of indicative figures for solar on a levelized cost of electricity basis, but we're not looking at, say, differences in the tariff regime for dispatchable and non-dispatchable electricity. As I've already noted, you know, in many instances, hydropower does not, in fact, provide that baseload power. And in fact, what we're seeing in many of these cases, for example, in Kukatamba, is a likelihood that the dam will be off kind of 4 or 5 months of the year to retain some sort of seasonal flow regimes. And that's actually much more difficult for an energy planner to deal with than a source that's kind of that's variable on an hour-to-hour basis. But we are looking at ways that we can include storage costs into our consideration of alternatives. And in particular, where there are opportunities for these two things to work together, so using existing hydropower assets in particular for pump storage to support the development of alternatives that have lower impacts and better return profiles. But yeah, this is something that we think needs improvement. Final thing I'll just emphasize is at the figures that we were looking at in the pilots, you could add storage to the variables and it would still be cheaper.
Thanks, Ben. So we have a question from Michelle TM, who asked how sediment flux is calculated in the tool.
Justin, do you want to have a go at this, or shall I?
Ben, would you mind taking the reins?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So essentially, the way that the methodology works is that we've used highly reliable data sets. So we looked at a few different available data sets for global sediment flux, and we can provide the full set of sources afterwards. And what we do is we look at 281 dams, we produce geospatial profiles for each of those, and we see how significant different indicators are in instances where dams have have suffered problems and seen delays as a result of environmental and social factors. And one of the indicators that we found was statistically associated with greater risk of delay was sediment flux. And in particular, we found that where a dam had a greater impact on sediment flux, it was at greater risk. And so we're scoring the 0 to 100 on sediment flux on the basis of that risk. So not in this instance, there is an alignment and a correlation between the two things, how much sediment flux there is and how much risk there is. But what we're scoring is the financial risk, and that's the score that you get on that table. I hope that provides enough detail, but there is a full methodology document, which is quite lengthy, and that's available on the riverscope.org website, and we invite any of you who have kind of technical questions that we're not able to answer sufficiently to check that out.
Thanks. So we've got a question from Michael Simon, who's wondering if you guys could describe how financiers or investors have used Landscope, the previous tool that you'd worked on, to inform their decision, if you have examples of that, and maybe what you think that might look like for investors, you know, in the Riverscope case, who are interested in ensuring that their portfolios and energy projects are providing a positive contribution to the climate crisis.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. I'll just provide two sets of examples that are somewhat contrasting. So in the first instance, Landscope has been applied by a group of companies working in concert. So that includes the largest buyer of sugar, the largest trader of sugar, and the largest producer of sugar in Africa. And what these guys were interested in doing was understanding which of their processing units were particularly exposed to social risk. And they used Landscope to survey, I think, about 300 odd processing units to identify those that had the greatest risk. In those that had the greatest risk, they pulled out priority issues that had been identified through the quantitative process and subjected those to further due diligence, risk mitigation, and risk avoidance investment. And so that process, in a sense, prefigured what we've done to develop Riverscope further by adding these kind of additional layers on top of the quantitative piece. And that has been used by those companies to inform their reporting for certification and their applications for development finance, as well as in their attempts to improve the efficiency of their operations and the consistency of the outputs in their supply chains. Another example would be a development finance institution that focuses on infrastructure that used Landscope to scan across its portfolio of about 550 assets. And that they had a kind of essentially a similar motivation in mind. What they wanted to do is filter through and identify the assets that really needed the most attention. But they were interested in compliance with the IFC performance standards, and were using Landscope specifically to pick out issues related to standards compliance. And that's something, again, that we've done with Riverscope here. Our pilot for Batang Toru looks at the way that that Riverscope highlights non-compliance issues for that dam against the IFC performance standards. But we can also tell from the fact that Riverscope has been used over the last, Landscope has been used over the last 2 years on 15,000 unique occasions, that people are really using this for a variety of purposes, from scanning and screening to informing broader due diligence processes to engaging with other investors, and other developers. And we think that Riverscope can be powerful in all of those areas in the hydropower sector, whereas we've noted at the moment, the assessment process is particularly kind of opaque and hard to engage with.
Thanks, Ben. And yeah, I guess we as International Rivers should say that it was, in part, and in large part, because of the success of Landscope and its application that made us so eager to pursue the idea of Riverscope as a tool. So we have a related question from Alison White from the Arcus Foundation, who asked, what impacts or results you've had using Landscope that you think will be replicated with Riverscope.
Thanks very much. So again, I'll just kind of split this up a bit, because I think Landscope and Riverscope has kind of one set of applications for actors that already see themselves as sustainable or responsible, and for those guys, the applications are largely those that I've just kind of described. We're looking at the way that the tool can be used to establish compliance and compliance risk across a broad range of standards across large portfolios. And that what we've seen with Landscope is that the most problematic cases have been subject to further due diligence and, if appropriate, excluded from those portfolios or from access to concessional finance. And that, for Riverscope, is one thing that we'd definitely like to see happening and that we hope can support, that the tool can support. At the moment, concessional finance is absolutely critical for most hydropower projects. They are a keystone investor in almost every instance. In some of the projects we looked at, they provided all of the capital available. But what Riverscope can do is help those guys to see that hydropower assets are not only exposed to commercial and financial risks, which is common for the projects that they look at, but they also create these enormous and very hard to manage and avoid environmental and social impacts. So I think that's an important part of the market, but we think that Riverscope is also extremely valuable to actors who don't necessarily see themselves as sustainable, but would like to start on the road towards more responsible practice and would like to reduce their exposure to risks in the operating environment. And there, Riverscope is very powerful, and we've seen this with Landscope because it's very easy to access, it doesn't require a large number of inputs to use, and it provides quantitative, practical outputs that can be used in the business process. And so for those characteristics, basically remove the barriers to responsible practice or to considering responsible practice for those actors. They can apply this tool without our involvement if they would like, so that they can get genuinely confidential and independent results. And that really allows people who are sort of, be it investors or developers or companies or indeed energy planners, who are thinking about whether they can move forward with lower impact, to kind of identify viable, practical and specific ways of doing that.
Great. Just to flag that we're running short on time, but we've got certainly more questions to go through. The next being from Julie Clausen from Fisheries Conservation Foundation, who asked, other than wind and solar, have any other alternative hydropower technologies been included? So that includes, small hydro, local, divested.
No, we haven't looked at other hydropower technologies in our assessment, although that is an interesting thing to do. The reason that we used wind and solar is that information on them is available fairly universally. And therefore, we were able to produce figures that represented local values. And so it's no good for us to compare hydropower to, in, say, Guinea to solar in New Mexico, for example. We need to be able to compare it to a local project that is developed under local conditions. And the data required for that is really kind of only available for wind and solar. Any hydropower project, even a very small one, will have a kind of unique set of conditions that requires a lot of analysis. But certainly there are other opportunities in most of the areas that we were looking at. So, for example, for Batang Toru, it was clear that geothermal was an option in the area. In some other instances, we saw sort of biomass, biogas options, although the sustainability of those is questionable. So, we're not really trying to champion wind and solar specifically as technologies. We're just trying to point out that in most instances, there are alternatives that are cheaper and that could be sited far, far more flexibly than hydropower, therefore kind of avoiding the most sensitive locations.
Great. And potentially the final question is from Naret, who asked whether the indicators used, the social indicators, are used to measure the resettlement sites. So what I presume are the kind of host communities where resettled populations would be moved.
No, we don't. I think that's a really powerful thing to look at in the qualitative investigation. And indeed, that is something that we do in all of our cases. Again, what we're looking for here is a tool that can be kind of relatively agnostic from the off and doesn't require a substantial number of inputs. And knowing the resettlement sites requires you to be quite far down the process. And what we're looking really to do is to see this tool applied at a kind of earlier stage, so that planners can realize that the number of people that is in fact likely to be displaced, either physically or economically, is likely to be kind of too high for the project to move forward, or will create financial obligations for the project that reduce its commercial competitiveness.
Thanks. And maybe one last question from Michelle from WWF, who asks whether the tool is publicly available now, and if not, if there's a plan to kind of make the tool I guess publicly available or usable by the public in the future.
Great question, yeah. So at the moment, all of the information on the tool is available at www.riverscope.org. If you'd like an assessment, please get in contact with us. We just really need the location that you're interested in. If there is demand for this, particularly among investors, we will automate the tool in a similar way to Landscope, but we will judge that decision on the basis of the reaction we get to this launch, not least.
Great. Well, that's all we have time for, unfortunately. We have a lot of good questions and I think good participation from the audience. So thanks so much for taking part and for asking good and tough questions. Thanks so much to Justin and Ben for I think a great presentation and really showing the tool and what it is and what it can be. I think we're really excited to see on the basis of this, what we think is a really strong kind of pilot experience, to see how it can be expanded and to further refine and added more functionality to address some of the very good kind of points that I think we heard today. So just you know, to thank you all again for your participation, and you know, we'll be sure to share materials with you and make sure to keep you informed as the tool evolves. So you know, please do get in touch with us if you know, there's more you want to learn or potentially to get involved as we kind of expand it out. So yeah, thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Thanks very much indeed. Bye now.
Thanks all. Cheers.